I'll read the intro stuff. We're conducting this meeting by electronic means as permitted by the open meeting law because of extraordinary circumstances. This meeting will be conducted electronically and will be live streamed, recorded, and posted for later viewing. Everyone other than the person speaking should put their microphone on mute. Don't use the chat function except for technical difficulties. We should always communicate through speaking so anybody who is monitoring the meeting or watching it later can not miss out on anything that's going on. Let's see. When you participate in discussions, start with your name so that everybody knows who you are. And also if you're making a motion or seconding a motion. All votes will be taken by roll call. And if you are leaving the meeting, let us know so we can make sure we continue to have a quorum. I will now bring the meeting to order. First up is approval of the agenda, which is by consensus. If anybody has any concerns about what's on the agenda, go ahead and speak now. Otherwise, we'll consider the agenda approved. Anybody have any concerns? Not seeing any? Okay, we'll go on with the agenda. Next up is approval of the minutes. Oh, I forgot to do the welcoming roll call, but we'll just roll that in with the approval of the minutes. Are there any changes to the minutes from the March 18th, 2021 meeting?
Motion to approve. Phil Klein.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second, Jenny Geisler.
Thank you. I'm not sure who's calling the roll today.
Councilmember Wolf, this is Jenna Ernst. I'm filling in for Sandy, so I'll call the roll for you all.
Thank you.
And I only know a handful of you, so I'm sorry if I mispronounce any names. Abdi, Fatima, Bruner.
Here.
Throdding.
You need to take more time between things so that people can say their name.
Okay. Geisler.
Here.
Graves. Hemken.
Yes.
Jalali. Keller. Klein.
Yes.
Metis Castillo.
Here.
Mokal. Morris. Nelson. Rowe.
Here.
Schroeder.
Here.
And Wolf.
I am here. Anybody who said here have a problem with the minutes, go ahead and speak up. Otherwise, we'll consider that all one, so we don't have to do another vote. Okay, I'm seeing.
Excuse me, Chair.
Up.
This is Abdi. I'm here.
Yes.
I didn't get the chance to.
So, well, your name was called very quickly at the beginning. I just want to make sure you're okay with the minutes.
Yes, I was okay.
Okay, great. Then we will move on to, we have no business items, information items, the draft regional demand, travel demand management study scope of work. Cole Hiniker.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me all? Can you all hear me? Great. As Greg's getting the PowerPoint pulled up here,
hold on a second. But Cole, hold on a second. Carl, can you mute? We're getting feedback. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. I am Cole Hiniker. I'm multimodal planning manager for our long-range transportation planning division here at the Met Council. So I work on the MPO role. We work in our department across all modes of transportation, and we develop the region's transportation policy plan. And we identified this need for a travel demand management study pretty recently, and I'll go through some of the reasons why we did that the next couple slides. But I wanted to start with the first slide, if you can go on to the next slide, please. Just to ground everyone in what travel demand management is. Sometimes it is called transportation demand management. They're synonymous. We do generally shorten this to be called TDM. So you hear that phrase a lot within the transportation planning sphere of work. This first definition here is what I call the very highway engineer definition here. Managing demand is about providing travelers, regardless of whether they drive alone with travel choices such as work location, route, time of travel, and mode. In the broadest sense, demand management is defined as providing travelers with effective choices to improve travel reliability. So it's really about making sure that we're meeting travel demands with the system we have as best as we can. And sometimes that might mean shifting travel out of the peak period so that the lane capacity that we have can accommodate more travelers throughout the day. But one of the reasons I put this second page, and of course Wikipedia is not an official source, it was sourced from somewhere else that someone drafted, but I really like this one because it really takes into account some new concepts like, as you are all familiar with and as we're all doing right now, telework. I think the first one is very infrastructure focused, whereas the second one is about the application of strategies and policies to reduce travel demand or to redistribute this demand in space or in time. And, you know, just the word space could include cyberspace. And I think that's one of the interesting things about that definition is that, you know, we can essentially reduce travel demand by shifting it to a different type of demand. Next slide. So just to ground you all in a couple of examples of what travel demand management strategies are, we have a number of these in this region. Quite a few of them are implemented by different agencies, but congestion pricing, you know, we have our min-pass lanes here. That is one way to regulate travel demand or to kind of control for it and make sure it's not over demanding the supply that we have available. Parking supply management, again, this is something you can do in government, but it's also something the private sector does quite a bit by pricing their parking to make sure that they control for demand there. Varied work shift times is something that we see, but of course we still, prior to the pandemic, had a lot of peaking with shift times from your sort of typical 8 to 5 or 9 to 5. Shifting modes or shifting travel to other modes like transit, biking, walking, and then carpooling is another option. Telework, of course, was not a strong focus of travel demand management over the past few decades, but has certainly been the past year. There are things like development ordinances that require new developments to have a travel demand management plan so that they account for the amount of increased trips and travel that a new development would bring to an area and make sure that they can distribute it in a way that takes advantage of infrastructure. Shared mobility, you know, things like Uber, Lyft, having availability of car sharing or bike sharing, all of those different options can help not just change one trip, but change how people travel overall. And then something that we have developed quite a bit more of in this region in recent years is travel information technology. So those signage that says, you know, how long is your trip expected to take? What is the demand or what is the parking availability at your location that you're hoping to go to? So these are just a few examples of what TDM has looked like historically. On to the next slide, please. All right, so we're going to be doing a travel demand management study, and so you might ask, what do we do transportation studies for? On the right here, there's really four primary reasons that we do studies. The first one would be to evaluate the performance of the system or system elements. We might look into how is the highway system performing, how is it meeting our goals or metrics for the region, and just identifying those opportunities or gaps. And then to prioritize investments across the region based on expected performance. So it may be used to evaluate 8 or 10 different transit projects or 8 or 10 different min-pass projects to see which ones would give us the highest return on investment. In some instances, it's meant to set or reevaluate a strategic direction. So, you know, one example here might be an area where the investment isn't as clear like a min-pass lane, but where we're trying to establish how do we invest that best match the values of the region? So it could be like that we want to shift more people to biking, and so we need a strategic direction that lays out how all our partners can do that across the region. And then in some cases, it's to learn more about an emerging topic. It's something that you maybe haven't heard about, but we're doing a study right now on electric vehicles and what the impacts and potential opportunities are for this region. So that would consider a study where we're just trying to learn more about a new topic. And the studies generally on the left here generally inform our transportation policy plan. So they might answer some questions or gaps within the transportation plan about where does this particular idea fit and how do we plan to address it moving forward through our strategic direction. And so for TDM, we really hope to address all of these different question marks as it applies to TDM. So evaluating the TDM programs, prioritizing investments based on potential performance, and in particular, evaluating our strategic direction and learning more about emerging TDM strategies. Next slide. So in terms of what we're looking for from you all today, I wanted to put this up front, but then I'll go through more of the scope. And so these are just questions to consider for discussion at the end. I would just upfront say that cities are major implementers of TDM strategies, whether it's through their land use planning, implementing of local infrastructure, and as well as I said, TDM controls that they might have on new developments that say, that regulate parking or that regulate the types of strategies that developers or property owners have to have in place to make sure we're not creating too much demand on the transportation system. And so, land use controls are essential as part of TDM. I think without them, we really wouldn't see nearly as impactful change in travel demand management without them. We've even seen some emergence of things like incentive programs where different cities are asking new developments to provide transit passes or flexible passes that would encourage their residents to use it, and the costs are usually borne by the developers. So that's just another kind of emerging strategy that we're seeing here. And the second question, and so the question there is where do you see, what are you maybe seeing from your local governments, but also what do you see as opportunities in this area? The second question is really how do we best engage cities, property owners, and developers in this study? As a starting point, we want to know what all the different cities are doing across the region and learning about the existing practices that are in place. We'd also like to identify strategies and make sure that there's a realism check on it from local governments about, not suggesting things that would never be implementable. And then also creating helpful tools for local governments to implement these strategies. And so at this stage, we're getting ready to go out for RFP, so we have plenty of time to work through how to engage cities, and would love to hear any insights you have on that. Next slide. So we did do some past work in TDM, and it was helpful. But at this point, it's over 10 years old. We did a travel demand management evaluation and implementation study back in 2010. It did have a very impactful role in our regional solicitation for federal transportation funding. It actually helped create a TDM innovation funding pot where we solicit for ideas from local stakeholders and implementers. And we selected 23 projects since 2014 for over $5 million in federal funding. A few examples would be the Metro Transit transit app that maybe you guys have heard about or seen. Also, an expansion of the shared bikes facilities in the region was funded out of this pot. So there's been a number of different programs that have been funded that have helped advance TDM at particularly at a local scale. Also, improved coordination and marketing of TDM tools across multiple partners. We've brought some things under a unified brand and helped coordinate some of the naming of our TDM partners to have a more cohesive approach there, particularly with the TMOs and their partnerships. And then we've explored a number of different TDM strategies like variable message signing, parking cash out programs. That was something the U of M and MnDOT explored. And so there's been a few touch points here, but it really the first bullet here was the focus of what we've done with that evaluation and creating a new TDM innovation pot and using that to evaluate projects in the solicitation. This plan did not address shared mobility, which really was just in its infancy in 2010. It didn't address telework in much detail or MinPass and the opportunities that our expansion of the MinPass program would create. And it also had limited guidance for implementing new strategies. And that was partially just a result of it was a lower budgeted study at the time, and it had more of a focused outcome in terms of directing that regional solicitation funding. Next slide. And I also wanted to just highlight that, you know, we acknowledge that there's emerging policies and trends that really necessitate a refresh in TDM. For starters, TDM has been identified as a top strategy in our regional congestion management process, which is a hard process, and also in our highway mobility process. We're actually just wrapping up a highway mobility needs assessment, and it still talks about travel demand management as some of the highest return on investment for the dollars that you can put into it, as opposed to, for example, expanding a highway. Sometimes you can get similar benefits without needing to expand the infrastructure. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of guidance on how to best do TDM, particularly for counties and MnDOT that are looking at these highway expansion projects. TDM is oftentimes at the city level, and those aren't often the agencies that are doing the studies on the corridors. So I think there just needs to be a better coordination and better guidance for all our different stakeholders and how they can work together on TDM. Just also would acknowledge shared mobility and technology have evolved rapidly since 2010. You know, the photo here on the right is actually a shared pogo stick program that is emerging. It's called like Kangaroo, not surprisingly. Very interesting just hearing about all these new ideas for how people would want to travel, and a lot of these ideas didn't even exist in 2010. And of course, not a surprise to anyone here, telework and our shifting travel patterns and expectations that have resulted from COVID-19. I believe, I can't remember if you guys have heard about the travel behavior inventory that we've done as part of our program at LUAC here, but we've looked at how travel has changed, and you know, upwards of 40% of people are teleworking currently, whereas it was more in the 5 to 10% range prior to COVID. So that's been a huge shift, and while we expect there to be some return to normal, I think there's a huge opportunity to figure out if this could be a longer term trend. Because if you were on the highway system in the last year, you might have noticed that there was very little congestion for the majority of the past year. Also, the region is investing heavily in the expansion of transit, bikes, and managed lanes. So there's a huge opportunity to take advantage of those investments and be strategic about it. Next slide. And equity and climate are regional focuses that have also emerged since the last study. I think that we all know that TDM strategies are not always implemented equitably or considerate of all users. And so we need to make sure that we take an equity lens to this. And on the right here, there's a chart from a national survey of percentage of households that switched to telework because of COVID pandemic. And you can see that a large percentage of those making over 100,000, the majority of folks did. But when you look at the lower end of this scale, the opportunity just wasn't there for lower income folks. And so I think this idea that we need to make sure that our strategies aren't only focusing on benefiting a subset of the population, and that there's equal opportunity across all population groups. And then climate change is also emerging as a conversation in this region. There was recently some work done at the state level to look at climate change policies, and there's some recommendations about reducing emissions and reducing vehicle miles traveled, and potentially having a goal for that. And TDM is really one of the key strategies to help get to a vehicle miles traveled reduction goal. And so this would really build upon that work being done at the state and even broader. Next slide. So generally speaking, I'm just going to touch on the tasks at a very high level and then hit on a couple of highlights in the next few slides. We always have project management as a task in these studies. The first major effort here would be to do some regional existing conditions summaries and analysis. So looking at what is out there today, what types of programs are cities, counties, state governments, even property developers, employers, what kind of programs are they implementing, and what do they feel like the pros and cons of a lot of their strategies are. We expect to accomplish this a lot through interviews or surveys or focus groups. So this would be an engagement heavy step. and making sure that we're engaging with all those that might have some TDM program being administered. And so again, we have, I'm sure Angela on the call knows the exact number of cities, but something like 190 cities. And so to get to all of them, some form of survey or even focus groups is likely how we'll have to approach that. We would then have the consultant look at national best practices and really identifying some opportunities where this region could be doing more based on what they're seeing in similar regions that have similar issues. There may be restrictions with state law that we could explore changes to, but oftentimes there's just there's a cultural element where maybe we just never went down a certain path, but the rest of the country has. And so that could be a gap or an opportunity for us as a region to highlight where we're seeing in other regions. The consultant would then develop a framework for how do we look at TDM as a region? What are some of the goals for what we're hoping to achieve with TDM? And then evaluate both the existing strategies that we have in the region and how they contribute to that framework, but also add in new strategies and recommendations for things that we could be doing more of as a region to help further the outcomes that we're looking to achieve and to bring us more in line with the state of the practice. Some examples that I think that we already know of nationally are a lot more parking management strategies, and you're starting to see that emerge here. Minneapolis and St. Paul are both eliminating their minimum parking requirements for development, and just there's a lot of opportunity in this region to look at that differently, particularly where there's transit investment happening, where you really have access to multimodal travel. And basically the consultant will take this evaluation and recommend a set of strategies that they think are helpful for the region to advance. And again, these bullets here on the framework and the evaluation of strategies would have another substantial engagement effort with regional stakeholders, because we want to make sure there's buy-in from those that would be implementing a lot of these strategies. And in many cases, we do expect that to be cities, property developers, businesses, major employment centers. And the implementation plan for this particular study isn't going to be a regimented step-by-step process, but more of a suggestion for the next steps that the region needs to take to advance the strategy. And then there may be additional work needed. Throwing out ideas like model ordinances for cities that want to adopt a TDM ordinance for new development might be one potential strategy. Next slide. So I wanted to highlight one unique aspect that I don't think has ever been done in a TDM study nationwide, and that is that we acknowledge that TDM strategies right now may vary based on underlying assumptions about the future that really could be shaped by TDM, but there's also a high that they won't be shaped. They're more about a national cultural thing. And what we're thinking here in particular is about the telework phenomenon. There may be a desire to approach TDM differently if telework were to continue at COVID-19 rates or even half the COVID-19 rates, so that there's a different focus that you might have as a region if you don't have the huge peaking during the morning and afternoon commute that we've experienced in the past. We've historically seen a lot of peak hour commuting in this region, and what we're actually seeing in recent months is, or I should say in the last year, is more of a flatlining of the curve throughout the day. So there's actually some theories out there that travel is going to return to previous levels, but without the morning and afternoon peaks, and it's actually just going to be spread out throughout the day more. And so that could greatly influence how we look at TDM. It might be a shift away from the commutes and away from the peak hour and towards strategies that are more about all-day travel or all types of trips. And then, of course, another one here is transit demand. If that were to permanently shift away from, again, peak hour commuting, that could have some different strategies. And so our idea here is to develop a matrix about the different strategies the consultant looks at and talk about how those impacts might be higher or lower based on some underlying assumptions. And those scenarios are yet to be defined. I think we'd ask the region to help define those for us. But just a few examples there about telework and transit being possible scenarios to frame this around. Next slide, please. I guess guess I already kind of spoke to this, but the implementation plan will not be that prescriptive. We do acknowledge that there might be additional work, both from the consultant to help flesh out some of the recommendations in the future, but also work from our partners. And so, as cities being major implementers of TDM strategies through development controls, we really want them to be engaged at the forefront and tell us, what might you actually explore in the future? What ideas emerging from this study are local governments interested in? It doesn't mean that every government has to be interested in them, because a lot of times these can be optional programs, but particularly the council providing guidance or tools for those governments is where we'd like to see this going, and then any other opportunities that cities see as having value. But there's other partners too that may have a role in that. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about our engagement approach. I spoke about the interviews and stakeholder workshops and survey tools. We are planning to bring this through a number of different committees. On the transportation planning side, we do typically coordinate through our Transportation Advisory Board and their technical advisory committees, such as the TAC Planning Committee. Obviously, the Council's Transportation Committee. We'd likely also engage with the Equity Advisory Committee, and I would be open to coming back to this committee as well. But I think that as opposed to using LUEC, for example, as a surrogate for cities, we do want to work directly with cities, and so to the degree that we come back to this group, maybe to talk about how to do that best, I think that the feedback here would be really valuable. The second to last bullet there about engagement. This is actually a newer topic that we're exploring, the idea of hiring a separate consultant to do engagement with community organizations that could help broaden our input to include more localized feedback from neighborhood groups or community organizations that represent different racial backgrounds. And that would be separate actually from the TDM study, because I think there's a big opportunity to hire a firm locally that has those connections already in place. And oftentimes when you hire a firm that has transportation planning experience and they try to fulfill this gap in their consultant contract, they won't necessarily have the connections here locally to hire the consultant that the council would prefer. So we're really hoping to take that out of this and do a separate consultant contract. And this is still kind of under development, but that is our hope, that we can have a separate consultant contract that really brings in community organizations and does really authentic engagement with them throughout the study. I think that the last bullet here is that we really think this TDM framework is where we're going to get a lot of engagement about what are the goals we should be hoping to accomplish with TDM. And then once we get to the step of strategic assessment, what are some reasonable next steps for the region? This is where we see the majority of engagement to help shape this study. Really being that, what values do you want reflected, and then what strategies do you think are reasonable and realistic for the region? So that's where we expect and hope to get the most input from our broad stakeholder engagement. And the next slide is the schedule, and then that'll be the last slide before the discussion. So tentatively, we're planning to release the RFP this summer, hopefully within the next month, begin this work in the fall of 2021, and likely wrap up 15 to 18 months later with a final study. The 2050 Transportation Policy Plan and Regional Development Guide is probably going to begin drafting in 2023. So we really see this as dovetailing very nicely into our efforts on the regional policy and the next policy plan update. And then, of course, that feeds in the next round of comprehensive plans, and that's where cities could dive deeper into some of these issues as they look at their comprehensive plans and some of their controls for implementing that. So that's I think the timing of this works out quite well. The next slide. This is really a repeat of some of the previous feedback that I gave you. Essentially, land use controls are an essential aspect of TDM. Are there ideas or things about this scope that you've all heard that you have concerns about or interest in or have comments on. And then in the second one is the best ways to engage with cities in trying to do the type of work we're hoping to accomplish with this study. So would welcome any feedback on anything we presented on today. And I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you. I can't see everybody's faces or names, so go ahead and speak. Oh, I can see more now than I could, but go ahead and you can raise your hand or unmute or just ask for my attention if you want to comment or ask a question of Cole.
Madam Chair,
Go ahead, Jerry.
I'm just kind of curious. This issue seems, why isn't this issue handled by MnDOT? Why is it being handled by the Met Council?
Well, that's a good question. I should have spoke that MnDOT is a strong partner on this project. They're likely going to be a participant in our project management team. And I think part of the struggle is that we're looking at it as a regional perspective, not statewide. And so any statewide effort would be handled by MnDOT, but they do defer to the Met Council if it's a regional specific study generally. But that does not take away from the fact that MnDOT is going to be a huge partner on this study. And in fact, they're actually leading a couple of pre-work efforts with the U of M to research the telework phenomenon. And so we're going to learn a lot from that work that MnDOT's doing already. And we actually talked about them being a funding partner on this study, but unfortunately our money, it just has weird rules. So we decided not to blend our funding sources, but they're definitely a strong partner in this study and will also be a strong implementer of the results.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Madam Chair,
Go ahead, Trista. I'm not hearing you. No, it's not muted, it's green, but it's like you've got a data problem. Oh, now she's is muted. I can see you, but I can't hear you, even though it says it's not muted. But I have this swirling whirl of death going over your face. Maybe if you shut off your video.
Yeah.
There, I heard you for a second.
able to hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So Cole, thank you for your presentation. And I know we've done a lot of work on racial equity and, you know, having been on the tab and seeing the work that's going on there around racial equity, it makes it more apparent that that area is missing in this presentation. And I know you mentioned briefly that you're thinking of contracting with an agency that has those authentic relationships in our communities of color. I would just encourage that we don't make it an other or another step of the process, but that we're really going out of our way to include our BIPOC communities in all these decision making along the way, especially when you see things like the statement around, you know, work from home is continuing and no travel for non-work is up. That's a really white lens to be presenting, because we know with the data that most communities of color, many and low income communities, continue to work throughout the pandemic and didn't have the opportunity from working from home, and that our transit system wasn't necessarily available to them at the times that they need for shift work. And so I think we just really need to push ourselves and go further in how we're engaging our communities of color so that we really are working towards a transit and racial equity lens in this work.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Well, Madam Chair, I'll
Go
ask
ahead,
something
Jerry.
else.
Go ahead.
Are you getting, Cole, are you getting good responses from all the cities in the 7-county metro area? Do they seem, enthused or wanting to participate and giving you, accurate information and data about this?
We haven't, Madam Chair, if I can respond.
Yeah, go ahead.
We haven't reached out yet because I think we're really hoping to kick off the engagement once the consultant gets on board. And so, one of the ways to start prepping folks is to present it through our committee process. So we were up at TAC planning last week and started rolling it out to the different avenues that we have. But I suspect that we will start reaching out in the fall to start gathering that feedback. And so, again, for folks like you, if you're, working with any groups that have a lot of touch points with cities, it never hurts to just hear it from different venues. And so, talking about this opportunity upcoming and relating it back to the communities you work with would really help us in terms of building that awareness and prepping folks. But we will certainly start, coordinating with all cities more directly this fall.
One of the things that popped into my head, this is Wendy again, thinking about this is the parking regulation stuff. I understand that they're going to no minimum parking, but there are some cases where they've been pushing for cutting down what developers want to do because they think their tenants need. I've heard that from developers, particularly of high-end condos where people can afford to have a car and just leave it in the garage all the time and not being able to have a place to put their car. But it also made me think about people who live in areas where you park on the street and snow removal can't happen very efficiently. So you end up with the little goat paths that you're trying to walk onto if you're a pedestrian. How that impacts people who maybe are, have balance issues or are in a wheelchair or have little kids and heavy groceries, and they might be maybe having to take them from far away where they could find a place to park their car. But the other thing that also popped into my head was during the summer, or no, not summer, during the spring, when we saw the increase in carjackings, and also the increase in catalytic converter thefts. The Minneapolis Police Department put out a message saying, park your car in a locked garage. Well, if you live in a place where everybody parks on the street, you can't park your car in a locked garage. And so you're at more risk of things like catalytic converter thefts. And so I think taking a look at how these things actually work in practice with real world conditions versus the kind of potential for how they work is an important part of the discussion, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and similar to the comments by Master Castillo, the idea of making sure that we speak with different groups that have different expectations for travel is going to be really important to that point. Different stakeholders all have an interest in how we approach strategies of that nature, and I think getting a broad depth of information from stakeholders will help us understand what's realistic and what helps people of different backgrounds. So that's going to be really important, particularly when we start bringing forward strategic recommendations. And I would say upwards of 50% of this budget for this study is on engagement, and then we're going to supplement it with additional engagement to target more community organizations.
Great. Anybody else have questions, comments? Krista, your hand is still up, but I think that's up from before. I'm not seeing anybody. Kathy, were you raising your hand or adjusting your computer? You're muted.
Adjusting.
Oh, okay. Last chance.
Chair Wolf, it's Phil Klein.
Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I think if you engage the different stakeholders would be extremely helpful because you need to get to the grassroots of what their issues are and what really will impact what they're wanting to see. I think that's very reasonable and makes the most sense. I think they would provide a lot of direction as far as which way you should go or what types of policies you should be implementing. I mean, I think we could talk about this here in this committee, but I think that's where the rubber meets the road is with those groups and having long conversations with them. There's a lot of different variables out there. You know, we've got the telemarketing, we've got the mass transit. I got the EV vehicles and so forth. There's a lot of variables right now that are up in the air, and those groups I think could provide you with more pertinent information closer to the, like I said, grassroots that would have an impact on them directly. One thing that I would like to see is somewhere in the transit system that would allow all people to be able to get to their jobs, be it like an industrial park or whatever, so they could actually walk to those places and get to them in a reasonable time. Many times, well, I shouldn't say many times, from what I've seen, those transit stops are not really located in areas that are conducive to walking to or relatively close to where places where people work. And I think that would be very helpful as far as locations on some of those things. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. The information coming out of the transit safety work also will probably provide some good information for the travel demand management study because of looking at, do people trust the system and want to come back? Or are they afraid they're going to be stranded? Those sorts of issues, because you have to know that the bus or the train is going to come on time if you're going to trust it to get to work, because nobody wants to be late to work. Okay, anybody else? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next agenda item. Thank you, Cole. And everybody feel free to email Cole if you think of anything else. Send him people that he should talk to or groups.
Yeah, that
Go
was
ahead,
exactly
Cole.
what I was going to add, was just that idea. If you have any ideas for ways we could, raise the awareness of this study, if there's different groups that you would like us to present to, feel free to send them my way. And otherwise, just, don't be shy about bringing this up with groups that you work with and say it's coming, it's going to be important. And that's really why we're here today, is just to put it on your radar. So thank you.
Thank you. Next up is the Ecosystem Services and Greenspace with Ellen Esch.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. So I haven't, had the pleasure of presenting at LUAC before. So just for a bit of context, I'm a senior data scientist on the research team, and a lot of my work is focused on developing the regional land use model. But I also have a background in ecology, which forms the basis for the work on ecosystem services and green space, on which I'll be speaking about today. So next slide. All right, for the next 20 minutes or so, this is what you can expect. So first, I'll give a brief overview on what are ecosystem services and what is green space. And then next, I'll provide a bit of context on how our region has changed with respect to these two items historically, and also share some context about how green space is changing in more contemporary times. I'll discuss how green space intersects with equity considerations and how knowledge about past and present dynamics in green space could help inform a more sustainable future. And then finally, I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and understanding your perspectives on how green space fits into planful land use policy. Next slide. So to start, let me unpack what is green space. So green space, as I'll be defining it for this presentation, is essentially any area of land that's covered by plants. So on the right hand of the screen, there's a couple pictures which illustrate what green space can look like. So green space, of course, encompasses natural ecosystems like prairies and forests, but many other areas are covered by plants too. For instance, golf courses can be green space, as can residential areas or boulevards, which might have tree cover. And agricultural cropland is another regionally significant type of green space. Now, the reason that knowing something about how green space has changed across our region is because plants provide critical ecosystem services. Now, the term ecosystem services refers to benefits that come from nature and that are essential for society. Clean air, clean water, and biodiversity habitat are 3 examples of ecosystem services. So plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is important for air quality as well as regulating the climate. Then the structure that plants provide can also reduce erosion and runoff issues, and plant roots are effective sponges for taking up kind of excess nutrients like nitrogen, which can degrade water quality. So clean water is another major ecosystem service that plants provide. And finally, I've highlighted that green space can provide habitat for biodiversity, including plants themselves, but also various animals, insects, birds, etc. Now, maintaining biodiversity is essential to ensuring clean air and clean water. For instance, different species of plants can have different rooting depths, which can help with absorbing nutrients from water more effectively. And in the last several years, some of you might have seen some headlines that we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, an insect apocalypse, which are all alarming in their own right. But insects, for instance, are super important because declines in insect populations threaten food security as pollination of many crops. And importantly, a lot of crops for human consumption is directly reliant on insect pollination. So in essence, nature is kind of like the mixed use of the natural environment, where one land use, green space in this instance, can provide for a whole range of other beneficial functions. And as I go through this presentation, it would be great if you could please reflect on what are the environmental challenges or opportunities linked to green space in your communities so that this work can respond to that. Next slide, please. So now that you understand a bit about what green space is and why it's important, let's step back and get a bit of perspective on how our region has changed. So at the turn of the last century, this region was primarily dominated by natural ecosystems, which the map on the left shows, and this is a visualization from 1985 at the time of the Generalized Land Use Survey. What you see here is that the Western Metro was largely hardwood forest with some pockets of pine and prairie mixed in. The Central and Eastern Metro was dominated by oak savannas and prairies. And now, 100 years later, there's been a nearly complete turnover in the vegetation and in land use. Now, as you all well know, our region is dominated by agricultural systems and the built environment. Now, not only has there been a change in vegetation type and quantity of natural space, there's also been a change in ecosystem quality and function. Ecosystem quality and function are much harder to measure because there are fewer long-term data sets that exist, and regionally, I'm not really aware of anything that stretches back prior to 1968. However, in 1968, the Breeding Birds Survey started, which is a widespread scientific effort that counts the number of birds and the number of bird species in a really regimented way and repeatable way. So counting the number of birds is actually a really good way to measure ecosystem function because birds are pretty good integrators of multiple aspects of an ecosystem. They rely on the habitat provided by green space for their own shelter. So declines in habitat quantity and quality can be reflected in bird populations. And in the 7-county council region, we're actually lucky enough to have a route that's just outside Lakeville, which is representative of patterns that have been seen globally in analyses of these data. So just in our own backyard, the Breeding Bird Survey has documented that we're only seeing half the number of birds, which is that green line. So we're seeing about half the number of birds now as we're seeing 50 years ago. And we're also seeing reductions in the number of bird species. So essentially, we know that green space has really changed in some profound ways over the long term. Next slide, please. In more recent years, there's some different techniques that can be leveraged to understand how land use and green space have changed. And specifically, we can leverage satellite imagery. So in the 1980s, our space agency, NASA, launched some satellites which essentially take pictures of the entire Earth's surface about every 2 weeks. Now these pictures have a resolution or a pixel size of 30 meters by 30 meters, but starting in 2017, we can get much finer resolution at the 10 meter by 10 meter scale. Now, these pictures are useful because they can give us some information about what the plants are doing, including where they are and how much they're growing. And this is provided by using the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. NDVI is a really widely used metric, and it works really well no matter what the life form of the plants are, grasses, trees. They all follow predictable patterns with NDVI. For higher NDVI, it means more plants, bigger plants, more plant biomass, if you will. And down at the bottom of this slide, you can see 3 images which show what NDVI looks like across a map. So here, NDVI is shown over a portion of woodberry, where darker green areas mean more plants, more vegetation, higher NDVI. So that white line at the top of the screen is I-94, which obviously doesn't have any plants growing on it, hence it's white. And on the leftmost picture in 1985, you can see that the region was largely farmland and really quite green. In 2005, the picture has changed quite a lot, and there's a lot of white areas, some development happening. And then in 2020, some of those developed areas have actually revegetated a bit and have regained some of their greenness, but it's still a very different picture than what we saw in 1985. So just a couple other points about NDVI and satellite imagery and how it can help us tell a story about Greenspace is that satellite images are processed really pretty quickly. So real-time measurements of greenness is within reach and it's possible. As always, there are shortcomings to every method, and for NDVI as a proxy of greenness and green space, a challenge is that it measures vegetation quantity, but doesn't give us any good information on vegetation quality, which is, of course, another important aspect here. So something to think about is how green space measurements, real-time measurements, might help inform and monitor land use decision in your communities. Next slide, please. All right, so this figure shows what nearly 40 years of greenness change across the metro looks like. For this, I analyzed what the average greenness was in every year for all the CTUs across the metro. And I just distilled it here into a plot with year on the x-axis and greenness on the y-axis. Again, just a quick reminder that a higher greenness measure, higher NDVI measure means more greenness. A lower number means more brownness or less greenness. And there's 1 point for every year, and these points are broken apart by the Thrive community designation. So a couple key takeaways come out of this figure. The first being that there has not been a significant loss of green space across our region over the past 40 years. There's a mid-2000s dip or stagnation, although since then NDVI has kind of increased across the board. However, I will say that it's important to remember that nothing about 1984, which is the first year that we can do this, nothing about that means it's a gold standard in terms of being a comparative benchmark for how we're doing on the green space front. Now, the overall increase in greenness across the region is perhaps not surprising because other temperate regions have seen longer summers, warmer temperatures, things like that, increase NDVI. And another reason is that you just saw that woodberry example where maturing vegetation can also lead to increases in NDVI. And in the agricultural aspect or the agricultural area of our region, improved technologies and fertilizers can increase crop yields, which means that the plants grow more, which is picked up by NDVI or these measures of greenness. Now, another key story coming out of this figure is that there's a huge variation in greenness across the metro. Agricultural communities in the light blue line on top of the figure here, they have way higher greenness than do urban and urban center regions, which are at the bottom of this figure in the light purple and orange lines. And if you want, I can further parse this out and show that even within urban center areas or even within suburban communities, whichever type of community you like, there's a lot of variation between and across individual communities. Next slide, please. So here's a quick example of how parsing out the changes in greenness can happen in a spatially explicit way. So in this map, I've highlighted block groups in blue, which have seen declines in greenness between 2015 and 2020. There's just shy of 500 block groups that have seen declines in greenness in the past 5 years. And the spatial patterns of this might be as you'd expect with some areas where new development is taking place, losing greenness. But rather than the specific patterns here, the important takeaway is that satellite-derived information of greenness can provide really detailed, spatially explicit information, again, on a 30 by 30 meter resolution if we want to drill down that far. So as the satellite sees it, all 8 million or so of those really tiny pixels across the region have a story to tell. And this is one example of how those stories can be interpreted. Next slide, please. So continuing to think about greenness and the spatially explicit patterns we see, here I've joined the greenness information with census data on population demographics and clearly shown that there are racial and economic disparities in greenness and green space. Panel A on the left is showing the percent of block group population that's comprised of people of color on the x-axis and how that's related to greenness on the y-axis. You can see block groups that are majority white have much higher greenness on average than block groups that are majority people of color. Panel B shows that block group income level also maps strongly onto patterns in greenness. There's a really steep slope between median household income and greenness up until $100,000, at which point this relationship stagnates. Now, this information could be useful in considering how land use planning intersects with equity and how those disparities might be addressed in the future. Next slide, please. Speaking of the future, another capability that we have when leveraging satellite data is to link greenness with carbon sequestration. It's intuitive that as the more plants grow, which is reflected in these higher greenness values, that means that plants are uptaking more carbon from the atmosphere. Under the hood, greenness needs to interact with weather patterns and vegetation identity, but essentially it's possible to tell a story about how carbon sequestration rates have changed over the past 40 years. So agricultural communities, again in light blue, they not only have the largest carbon pools, as you saw in that first figure, but they also have the highest carbon sequestration rates. So that means on your average 30 by 30 meter pixel, plants in agricultural areas are working harder to uptake carbon than are plants in other areas. And this can either be because the plants are bigger or simply because there's more of them. So once again, urban areas we're seeing really low rates of carbon sequestration there. This fact underscores the disproportionate role that agricultural communities could play in our region as it relates to sustainability and carbon balance goals. Coupled with evolving agricultural technologies, agricultural land is really recognized globally for the untapped potential it could play in contributing to some natural climate solutions to regulate atmospheric carbon levels. And this certainly could be true in our region as well. So more broadly, I'd argue that this final figure does really make the case that existing carbon stocks, as well as future carbon sequestration rates, should really be considered when guiding land use in order to reach climate goals. Next slide. So that concludes the presentation aspect here. And now I'd like to turn the conversation over to you all and hear what questions you have on top of your mind. Here are the three questions specifically that I'm looking for feedback on that have been highlighted throughout the presentation, just listed again here. So I'm curious as to what are the environmental challenges or opportunities that are linked to green space in your communities? And again, you can think about clean air, clean water, biodiversity, habitat. There's a suite of other ecosystem services that are linked to green space as well. I'm also curious as to how green space measurements might help inform and monitor land use decisions. And again, just a reminder that all of this can be done in real time with about a 2-week lag period, and that the patterns are spatially explicit. And then finally, something that you might consider responding to is, I'm interested in what opportunities are being considered to reduce inequitable distribution of green space. There are clear economic and racial patterns that we see in how green areas are. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions, comments? Courtney, you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Ellen, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very informative and bringing some things to life. I'll tell you some of the tensions, I've seen or at least felt. I've been able to participate in some of the Upper Harbor Terminal redevelopment. And as you think about that project in particular, redeveloping, what was kind of this old barge and trying to give the north side a connection back to the river. And but what you run up against is, sometimes development, and you think about how we make sure we're taking care of the river and taking care of those green spaces, they can oftentimes collide, right? And so, there is this need for affordable housing, but at the same time, people want to be careful about how you actually zone that land. And I think that project at least done a great job of being really thoughtful about creating the green spaces and while also balancing out that development. And so I guess, not a direct question, but just a point that, as we think about this, there is clearly inequity in how we have our green spaces in different communities. In a lot of ways that you'll end up seeing that changes, be some kind of partnership or do it in a responsible way that actually doesn't do more harm than good.
Yeah, Chair Wolf, council member. Yeah, thanks for that comment. And I know that there are several other projects underway at the council, such as the Surface with Purpose project, which is thinking about how impermeable, or like how roofs in particular could be leveraged to provide some green space and the suite of ecosystem services that come with that, specifically flood mitigation for green roofs and water quality. But one kind of cool thing is that quick overview of the map of Woodbury that I showed. I actually looked at it in downtown Minneapolis as well, and the green roof on the library that's downtown really shows up pretty prominently when you look at Greenness. And so it's just a great point that development and redevelopment certainly, needs to be thoughtful when you think about green space, but also that there are opportunities for kind of co-benefit here. So it's really something important to consider. Thank you.
Kathy, you're unmuted. Did you have something you wanted to share?
No, I'm sorry, I should be muted.
Oh, that's okay. Phil, you were also unmuted.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I guess here in Hugo, what we do is when we do any type of development project, we require that the developer provide park space, and that's a mandatory in order to them. In order for them to do their development, they have to provide a certain amount of acreage for parks for that community. That's one thing that could possibly happen in the inner city, because most of the folks of color do live closer to the inner city area. And when buildings are torn down, it would be nice to see some type of park that they would have access to, that would allow them to enjoy some of the amenities that the urban areas enjoy. And also to the point of having green space on top of these rooftops, I see no reason why we couldn't do that, or even alongside the buildings themselves. when I was in Hawaii, I know that they had parking ramps that had different types of plants and so forth growing on the sides of the parking ramps, and they were basically hidden by the vegetation. It's kind of cool looking. Now, granted, we have winter here and they don't, but still, it's it's an idea of how we can use different things to help provide greener space, for our residents.
Chair?
Well, I'll let Ellen respond first and then.
Yeah,
Go
thank
ahead.
you. Yeah, Councilmember Klein, that's, yeah, really interesting concept there, and point about, leveraging land for multiple uses. And just one thing that might be of interest, which I would be happy to pull together, is if there's any development projects that have occurred in the past 36 years where you'd be interested in seeing, like, monitoring how the parks and the green space that they've been mandated to establish, how they've been doing. That is certainly something that I would be happy to pull together and could be informative for kind of guiding future requirements if there's kind of a baseline area that or of services that these areas have to be providing, which we can monitor in real time.
Dan?
Thank you. I was just going to note one of the things that has come up in Roseville recently as we've been looking at, one of the things that cities do a lot of times as part of development is what's called park dedication. And you either require a certain percentage of the land or a certain number of dollars based on number of units and things like that. And so often in the past, it's been looked at, well, we'll take the dollars because we want to be able to put in, programmable large scale park space that serves people in terms of activities. And I think the thing that we're starting to realize is that sometimes it may make more sense in park dedication to maybe actually get a small amount of land in each of these developments that maybe is unprogrammed and natural space, because people are valuing that more and more, and there certainly are environmental benefits. And so we're starting to have to reevaluate some of our policies and some of our thinking about how we look at that to try to make sure that we are getting more green space into areas where people are, rather than sort of thinking about it in terms of developing programmable park spaces with fields and playgrounds and all those rather expensive things, and thinking about it, like I said, a little differently, so we get the benefits that we talked about with green space, maybe more broadly spread, as people have been talking about.
Councilmember Chair, yeah,
Yes.
great point. Yeah, I'd love to see how that conversation continues to play out. Thanks.
Madam
Jerry,
Chair.
are you waiting to talk? You can go ahead, Jerry.
Yes. Yeah, Ellen, I'm kind of curious. I'd like to hear your thoughts about, as the climate is changing in Minnesota, which means certain trees, certain grasses, certain shrubs will not make it, which certainly then that affects green space. So if you're thinking about putting in a park or whatever now, in 40 years, those things could die off, and then don't have much green space, really, no green. So what's your thoughts about how climate is going to play a role in green spaces and things like that?
Councilmember Chair, great point. Yes, climate change certainly is multifaceted, or has multifaceted impacts across the region. And this idea that you talk about of having like a lack of diversity essentially contribute to declining ecosystem function when various tree species or plant species get outside of their climatic niche with climate change is certainly a big issue. And I think that in really kind of simplistic terms, this is happening widespread throughout the more urban areas with ash trees, with the emerald ash borer, of course, not getting killed off, and with super cold winters and being a new emerging threat, right, that's facilitated by climate change, and that really threatening the green space across the region. So my thoughts on that is that there's a couple different ways that this can be tackled. Number one, of course, I think that biodiversity planning for biodiversity is important. It's this portfolio effect, right? You don't put all your eggs in one basket as it comes to various species, knowing that some are going to be disproportionately negatively affected. So you just kind of diversify there. So you build in some buffer for yourself. So that's really important. And then there's a lot of folks, including here in the region, thinking about how assisted migration is the term of various plant species could make for more resilient ecosystems in the face of climate change. So yeah, those are kind of my thoughts there.
Thanks. Is there anybody else? I had a thought that you talked about income and amount of green space, and I wonder if some of that isn't going to change a little bit as lots are getting smaller and smaller and houses are getting bigger and bigger. That's been a trend that's been going on. When I built my house 29 years ago, I have a less than 2,000 square foot house on a half-acre lot. And a half a mile from my house, they're building now $450,000 houses that are, 3,000 or more square feet on a much, much smaller lot. And I've got tons of trees in my yard. I didn't have any when my house was built, but I have huge trees now because I planted a bunch. But some of those newer houses don't have room on their yard for big trees because there's not enough yard between houses for trees to be able to grow. So I wonder if that dynamic of more expensive houses having more green space is maybe going to change.
Yeah, sure, Wolf. I think that's a really important thing to consider. And I think I'd like to turn that back to all of you, right? Knowing, like, now that we know something about how green space is changing across the region, and we can, like, if it would be of interest, these patterns can be drilled into on a much finer grain, right? Up to 30 by 30 meters, which is kind of, well, it's like a big lot size, right? And since 2017, we can look at 10 by 10 meter scale areas. And so how might knowing something about how land green space is and has changed inform some land use policies that you all might want to consider in the future?
Chair Wolf.
Carl, sorry, I was muted.
Yeah, and I muted and unmuted and screwed it all up. So we're from the same community. We kind of grew up at the knees of development, both you and I. We have a presentation in front of us tonight at Planning Commission where it's townhouses because we're driving density. It's in a fairly environmentally sensitive area with pretty huge part of wetland they have to work around. So there's some natural elements that are taking place, and of course trees provide cooling and grass provides drainage and absorption. But we're also driving smaller lots, which is being driven by the density requests from the Met Council. I still think fairly fortunate in Lakefield because we have a lot of drainage ways that we're essentially developing around. But as we drive smaller lots, part of that's cost because the infrastructure costs a ton to do. So there's no easy answer here to try and resolve this, and automatically, larger lots have more green space, which are better environmentally. So it's this whole push comes to shove, but larger lots are hard to develop because they cost too much to develop, which drives the cost of housing and affordability. And then you add on to that the current drive for environmental efficiency, which has added another price tag to the cost of building a house. They're building a much better house now than they were 20 years ago. There's some really solid structures going up that we didn't have 20 years ago. A lot of that gets to being driven by the environmental standards that have been added on top.
Yeah, great point. I think that one thing, just in terms of speaking about new development, is that yeah, there's a lot of variability in how new development is going to impact how green space changes on a very small scale. But kind of my last point is that, or that I made in the slides, was that understanding something about the existing carbon stocks and the carbon sequestration rates might actually be useful here, because of course, like a tree is going to sequester and store more carbon than a house will. Which isn't to say that that's, like, I don't want to be totally anti-developer, like that's not the message here. The message is just, though, that there's you know, all of this can interact in a way that might be able to help meaningfully inform more planful land use. And so all of these are really great thoughts, and I'm, you know, really looking forward to giving it all some good thinking, and maybe, you know, continue this conversation with you all.
Maybe Chair Wolf, if I could also add another kind of note. The other part, some of the areas that are getting developed, we're removing some stuff that was kind of sort of grassland prairie. It wasn't heavily farmed. We're also will be ultimately removing some stuff that's been very heavily farmed, so it's stripped right down to the dirt. And then it comes back. Oh, plus we'll have to throw some couple of feedlots in there, which are not exactly the most environmentally sensitive activity. And, you know, so all those things are happening, and it's not just unique to Lakeville, but as the farmland goes away or they develop even large lot developments, all of a sudden the feedlot is no longer a real popular thing to have. So, and how environmentally friendly the feedlot is, you know, it's still a farm, you know, so there's no silver bullet here.
And that's the crux of the matter, isn't it?
I think we also need to acknowledge how rules have changed over time for development too, because like you look at Minneapolis and they made a grid and they just drained all the wetlands and reformed things the way they wanted them to be. And you don't do that anymore in development. You go around the wetlands and have to have setbacks from rivers and all sorts of things that weren't the practice before. And so you see green space in suburban areas where they're temporary storm conveyance places that are grass most of the time and then fill up with water, you know, periodically, where the urban areas don't have that. Everything goes underground and then into the river ultimately. And so the solutions are different depending on what were the rules in place where when you were doing most of your development.
Yeah, great.
Anybody else have any thoughts or questions? Not seeing or hearing anybody. So thank you very much, Ellen. And feel free, if you think of anything else, to email Ellen. And we will move on to the next agenda item, which is the Climate Action Plan. Eric Wojchik.
Good evening, everybody. Can people hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair Wolf, and thank you, Land Use Advisory Committee, for having me here tonight. Hopefully last but not least, I'm here tonight from Local Planning Assistance and Community Development. My name is Eric Wojchik. I'm a planning analyst at the Council, and I'm here to talk to you about a really exciting project at the Council called the Climate Action Plan. We don't have a subtitle for this yet, so this is what we're going with, Climate Action Plan. And just to let you all know, I think the last time I was before this committee was in, I believe it was March of 2019 when I came to present on the Climate Vulnerability Assessment project. But I know that you have seen various climate projects over the last couple of years. So this will be another one for you to look at. Next slide, please. So today I'm just going to focus on what is the Climate Action Plan? In other words, why is the Council embarking on this journey? How does this fit with Thrive, with our policies within Thrive? Some key climate change markers within Minnesota and some terminology that goes along with that. And I'm going to focus today's conversation specifically on environmental justice, which is a part of the Climate Action Plan, and it's something that we're embarking on. It's a new component of our planning work. So I wanted to ask you a question at the end and just see your reaction to some of the statements within the presentation. I'll also be touching on the project approach and timeline, the process, and that we're hiring a consultant. And then, yeah, I'll end with that question on environmental justice. Next slide, please. Thank you. The way I'm kind of looking at this is I focus a lot on this sidebar piece, which is sort of what I would consider an elevator pitch for the project. This project really started in the fall of 2019 when council members identified a need at the council to really coordinate and consolidate our efforts on climate. We had been doing quite a bit of climate work since 2014, but those were principally discrete projects. They weren't programmatic changes. They were project by project, which is important, but there was no real kind of coordinating framework to pull everything together. So the whole purpose of this climate action plan is that it would unify our efforts across the council to reduce our climate impacts and prepare for a changing climate. It will define strategies that will strengthen our ability to plan and deliver services to the region through leadership, collaboration, and stewardship. So just to be clear, this climate action plan is internally focused, so it's more operational in nature. And that's really principally because we tend to do our best work when we get our own house in order. So that leading by example piece. That doesn't mean that we won't have climate within regional policy, but that will be a separate process within the next iteration of the Regional Development Guide. What is included within this project? Well, we're going to be making future commitments to climate, but we're also going to really try to integrate a lot of our project work and make sure that that's becomes part of our process at the council. All the council divisions are involved in this effort. We have a cross-divisional team, or a cross-organization team, I should say, comprised of regional administration, metro transit, community development, environmental services. All are represented on this team. And you might see the time frame there. It seems a little bit short. There's a reason for that. A lot of research suggests that if you actually have a quick turnaround in terms of your re-upping your commitments on climate, it actually produces better, more measurable outcomes. And the other thing with keeping that short time frame is it helps us if we need to pivot. So if there are new challenges that emerge within the next 5 years, we can re-up our commitments, but also potentially add new ones. Next slide, please. So this conversation today, I want to focus on some of these Thrive outcomes, but really the three principal outcomes that the Climate Action Plan connects with our stewardship. So obviously looking after our infrastructure, our transit routes, making sure that we're good stewards of our regional assets, make sure we're planning for maintaining our assets in perpetuity. So that's the sustainability and stewardship piece. And making sure we're looking to partner with our customers and stakeholders through a lot of our work. Equity, we've done a lot of work in equity within the last few years, but the piece that's important to this project in particular is that intersection of equity and sustainability, those two outcomes, which is really where we land on environmental justice. And if this is a new term for some of you, as it was for some of our team, environmental justice really recognizes that Black, Indigenous, and communities of color have borne the brunt of pollution and other environmental impacts historically. So as we design our climate action policies and implementation strategies, we look for opportunities for reparative and restorative environmental outcomes. In other words, just recognizing that the distribution of environmental benefits and burdens has really been inequitable. Next slide, please. So when we talk about environmental justice, these are some of the main components. Is this historical legacy of what we would call environmental racism, and I'll go through each of these as we talk. Current health disparities, which we see within our state, and this is common across the nation, often called the social determinants of health within public health realm. So where you live might determine your health outcomes because you might live near a highway or near a particular industry that might be polluting. When we approach solutions to some of these issues, policy and implementation solutions, sometimes they can create benefits for some and disbenefits for others. So how do we try to mitigate some of those unintended consequences of our policy outcomes? And that's where the environmental justice solutions come into play. So we want to carefully consider and work with local groups to think about how they've been inequitably affected historically, but also how can we repair some of that damage through proper engagement and helping, looking at things like co-creation of policy. Next slide, please. So as an example, we have areas that were historically disinvested in through redlining, and the legacy of redlining exists today, where there wasn't a lot in the way of lending to allow for investment into certain neighborhoods, and that's created, in a sense, a lot of the disparities that we see in our region today. And if you look at these areas in terms of environmental impacts, in terms of climate hazards, they do suffer from things like higher temperatures. There's less tree cover, less tree canopy cover in these areas. Quite often they're near or built on top of brownfields sites, and they can be close to heavy industrial uses. And that can cause health problems and lower quality of life and property values. People of color are twice as likely to live near facilities that can increase the risk of potential chemical exposure. And this has been studied across the US really since the 80s. And a lot of the federal policy around environmental justice was enacted in 1998. So there's been a lot of work studying some of these inequities. Next slide, please. And because of the environmental justice issues that we see historically, that social determinants of health piece is a major issue. So you have disparities that exist that are often place-based. You have a lot more people of color living in areas of high air pollution, and suffering the effects of air pollution, high incidence of asthma, and higher mortality rates and morbidity rates in these areas that experience higher pollution. Next slide, please. So when we look at some of what we do at the Met Council, well, how can we redress some of these issues? How can we deal with some of these things within the climate action plan, an operational climate action plan? It's a challenge, but we also have to think the most obvious solution might often not be a good solution. So creating green spaces and access to parks, these all seem like great things. Allowing for more electric vehicle charging stations, it seems great from an environmental point of view, but it could lead to things like gentrification, displacement, potential homelessness. You could end up with situations where, I went to a neighborhood group showing them some of our tools on our canopy tools and our extreme heat tool, and thinking that, of course the neighborhood wants to plant trees, but and this was after the tornado that went through North Minneapolis. The canopy is lacking in that area, and one of the neighborhood group members said to me, well, it's actually been nice having the trees down because we can actually see what happens in the streets. So for them, it was a public safety issue. So we may think that some of our policies or approaches might have a desired outcome, but without engaging properly with the community, we don't really know. So working with the community is really key. Next slide, please. So how do we approach environmental justice? Well, the key to this really is that a one-size-fits-all approach to doing our operational work does not always work out. our engagement in one neighborhood should maybe be different than how we engage in a different neighborhood because of the environmental justice issues that persist in that area. It's really key to build relationships with communities most harmed by environmental racism and the land use practices associated with it. Could we approach communities and have them share visions to guide a particular project? I know that we've been certainly better at doing that in the last few decades, but that's something that we can consider. And then collaborative action with communities. So share and provide resources, act with cultural competency, and be mindful of harm organizations caused or contributed to in the past. Next slide, please. So we know that climate change in Minnesota is occurring. And one thing we need to recognize is that while it's occurring for all of us, it's going to occur differently for some because some of us are going to have the tools and maybe the financial wherewithal to deal with climate change. So we need to think about our most vulnerable when we do our planning. What we are experiencing in Minnesota right now are warming winters. So we do have a very we're losing our winter lows, as many of you know, any of you who are involved in winter sports, ice fishing, snowmobiling, the winter lows are essentially going away. And we're approaching a point where we're seeing a lot more fluctuation above and below freezing, which is really causing huge issues in terms of our roads, our pipes, certainly in terms of the Met Council's infrastructure, looking at our in-ground infrastructure, and also our light rail and transit. But we're also seeing a lot more extreme rainfall, these high magnitude, high frequency events that are fairly localized that can cause local flooding. In terms of heat waves, thus far we have not seen a discernible long-term trend in heat waves as of yet. But the climatologists suggest that this is probably likely within the next 5 to 10 years that we'll be seeing a more of an upward trend in heat waves. Drought, heavy snowfall, severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, we have not seen any real switch in terms of outside of normal variability that we see in Minnesota currently. So next slide, please. So terminology that's really important in terms of our climate action plan. Some of you might have heard of mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, we've done a lot of work in this over the years, making sure that our facilities are retrofitted with more high efficiency lighting, electrifying our bus fleet, even accounting for our emissions and keeping track of our emissions so that we can set goals and targets to reduce them further. Adaptation is recognizing that climate is changing now and that we might need to right size our stormwater infrastructure, for instance, to deal with that. Adaptation can also be things like rerouting our transit routes to deal with things like localized flooding. So it's allowing us to adapt in the moment to changing conditions, but also trying to anticipate how the climate might change in the future, which is a little bit of a challenge. Resilience is a little bit harder to define, but what I would say about resilience is that when we do good mitigation and we do good adaptation in terms of strategy, resilience tends to be the outcome. So resilience is a little bit broader in its definition, and it really touches on some of those socioeconomic benefits that communities can experience. In other words, they might be able to thrive in spite of climate hazards. Next slide, please. So the timeline for this project, we're just getting going. Well, we've been at it for a while, but we've got about a year left. And we're just hiring a consultant now to assist us with some of the project management pieces of the work. One thing we're doing now, which is a fairly heavy lift, is to go across the council and interview as many work units as we can to really figure out who's doing what on climate and what aren't we doing on climate, because that's also really, that's interesting because that can inform where we're at. What is our baseline in terms of existing conditions? And that can inform us where the gaps might be and also where we want to go. So that's kind of where we're at. And we're out interviewing all sorts of people across the council. Next slide, please. And one thing we're hearing in these interviews, which is really interesting and pretty much uniform, is that there's a lot of enthusiasm for this work. There's a lot of passion behind doing more climate work at the council. And I would say that there's some people cannot see or don't necessarily readily see how their work might explicitly connect to climate. But getting them to think about it has been an interesting experience. And I think a lot of the work groups are finding ways that their work could connect to climate. Next slide, please. And just as an example, so going out and speaking to groups within environmental services, we find different approaches, in this case, approaches to reduce emissions. We're hearing a lot about optimization, process optimization, but also building optimization, energy recovery, but also another key component of a lot of our climate work is partnerships. We can't really do a lot of our work unilaterally. We need to partner with watershed districts, with the utilities. We work really closely with local communities, local governments, and the tribes to really move the needle on some of our operational components. Next slide, please. So I'm finishing up with this question, and it's kind of an open-ended question. And I'm asking the question because so we are going to include an environmental justice framework within the climate action plan. But I'd be interested to hear from all of you because you all have a really diverse suite of experience that you can draw upon. And I'd like to hear, how do you feel we could, how can environmental justice inform the desired outcomes of the climate action plan? I know you don't know what those outcomes are, but how could they help shape those outcomes? And how could a focus on environmental justice help us reach our desired outcomes? Does it change how we do our work? And in what ways could it possibly change that? I would love to hear what you have to say about that. And next slide. Well, keep it on this slide, actually, just so if you want to contact me, the 3 project manager details are on the last slide, but feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Jerry, you're unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Well, I just like to say, I kind of agree with a lot of things you say. At my age, I'm not going to be around forever. So when I talk about climate change and everything else, it's for my grandchildren and everything else. And I'd hate to see, as far as I can tell, the world is not getting better, it's getting worse. And climate change is exacerbating it. So, you know what? I think you're doing a fine job, but keep it up. And I agreed with a lot of what you had to say.
Anybody else? Trista?
Yeah, I'll just add thank you very much, and I know why there's a lot of passion and excitement for this because it's so critical and it really is a life or death in our planning as we think about the future, as Jerry has said. And I think that the environmental justice piece is really critical because so often in our past we have made decisions, not based on a justice aspect, and so we have put in, I think Highway 94 is a great example of how it went through a community of color. And not only did it, separate the community, but the long-term effect of the constant exhaust and emissions through a community of color and the disparities on health impact and what that environmental aspect is, or how earlier we were talking about green spaces and what that means, or lot sizes. But when we think about where there's areas of concentrated poverty, those sizes are even smaller with even less green spaces. And so I think it's really important that we talk about environmental justice, racial equity, health disparities, as well as our climate change. And so I think that all of that can inform our work as we're going forward, because everyone, regardless of income or skin color, deserves to have a healthy and safe place to live and to have access to green spaces and clean water, right? We have all the examples around the country of when this goes badly, right? And we want to make sure that we're getting it right. So I really appreciate this work, and I hope that we're looking through that lens of equity and environmental justice as we're building out this work and making our decisions into the future. So thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you. I have a question, Eric. The stats that you posted early in your PowerPoint, are those regional or national?
I should have said that. Yeah, those are Minnesota stats. That's from the 2019 report from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency called The Air We Breathe. I know they do these periodically on air quality. So those are Minnesota specific stats. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Not seeing anybody unmute. I'm not seeing any waving. You can speak up, unmute yourself, and just say, hey, if you have anything. Anybody? Well, in the agenda at the end of the PowerPoint, there is the contact info. If you think of something later and want to send Eric an email or ask him additional questions, you can certainly do that. I'm not expecting you to remember it from right now, but it's linked to the agenda also, so you can always find that information to contact them. Deb, did you have any? Thank you, Eric, for your presentation. Deb, did you have anything that we needed to share with people before the end of the meeting?
Chair Wolf, not at this time, no.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm glad we only had 3 things on the agenda because we had a lot of discussion time and we would have run out of time. Go ahead, Kathy. Kathy, were you trying to? Oh, okay. Well, thank you, everybody. There being no further information to discuss tonight, our meeting is adjourned. See you in 2 months.